On February 24th, 1986, the body of Sherri Rasmussen was found in her apartment in Los Angeles, California. Sherri's body was found by her husband, John Rutten, as he returned home from work that night. To John's surprise, when he pulled into the apartment building, the garage door was open and there was glass in the driveway. John also noticed that Sherri's new BMW was missing. As John went inside the apartment, he noticed Sherri laying on the living room floor with 3 gunshot wounds. She was wearing a nightgown and underwear, and her bathrobe was laying next to her. Around the apartment, there were obvious signs of a struggle. There was a broken vase and a bloody handprint next to their panic alarm. There was also a toppled credenza. Sherri had defensive wounds on her face as well as a bruise on her cheek. It also looked like she had been bludgeoned in the head, most likely by the vase. There were marks on Sherri's wrist that indicated that she had been tied up at some point. The gun had also been fired through her bathrobe to conceal the sound. There was also a bite mark on Sherri's arm that was later swabbed for DNA evidence. Lead detectives on the case quickly concluded that this was a burglary gone wrong. What detectives didn't know at the time was this was definitely not a burglary, and there was a much more sinister plot at play. This is the true crime story of Sherri Rasmussen and her 26-year-old cold case that was finally solved. Before I start getting into all of the details about this case, I do want to say that this was probably one of the most frustrating cases that I've ever looked at. The lead investigators on this case were a bunch of idiots. It was frustrating. Every single source that I read was basically saying the same thing. These lead investigators should definitely not be employed anymore. That's how frustrating this case is. Sherri Rasmussen was born February 7th of 1957 to Nels and Loretta Rasmussen. Sherri was very smart. She actually graduated high school at the age of 16 and entered college. By her late 20s, she was the director of nursing at the Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Her job duties entailed giving speeches and teaching new nurses as they were onboarding. Sherri and John Rutten met in 1983 at a house party. Their relationship grew super fast. John was attracted to a successful woman, and Sherri was attracted to the same in a guy. John actually graduated from UCLA with a degree in engineering and was just starting a new job. Once Sherri and John started dating, Sherri learned that John had a few skeletons in his closet. While John was earning his bachelor's degree in engineering from UCLA, he was also seeing a girl there going for political science. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. John has remained consistent in saying that him and Stephanie never actually were dating, but they were consistently hanging out throughout college. They did have a sexual relationship quite often. John even invited her over to meet his parents. They went on vacations together. I would say at some point, you're probably dating. The first red flags with Stephanie Lazarus was she would actually steal John's clothing, and then she would take pictures of him while he slept naked. So she basically was building like a little shrine of John. She really liked him. She was very fond of him, but John did not see her that way. He basically saw her kind of as a friend with benefits. Shortly after earning their bachelor's degrees, John went on to get an engineering job, and Stephanie actually went on to become a police officer for the LAPD. During that time, they continued to be friends with benefits and have a very close relationship. That is when John and Sherri met. Stephanie was unaware that John and Sherri were actually dating until she threw John a 25th birthday party, and Sherri was there with him. At that birthday party, Stephanie realized that John and Sherri were dating, and she actually fell into depression. A very short time after that birthday party, Stephanie actually found out that John and Sherri were actually engaged. She decided to write a letter to John's mom to basically get her feelings out on the table and express that she was very depressed that John and her weren't dating and John was engaged to this other woman. The letter said, "I'm truly in love with John and the last year has really torn me up. I wish it didn't end the way that it did, and I really don't understand his decision." Even though John and Sherri were engaged, John and Stephanie still talked all the time. Sherri would actually talk to her parents about how she felt with the John and Stephanie relationship. She didn't feel super comfortable that they talked all the time and thought that their relationship was a little weird. It turns out that Sherri had pretty good intuition about their relationship. During John and Sherri's engagement, Stephanie always called John. She told John that she was very depressed because she liked him. She asked John to come over one last time so that she could have some closure. During that time, they actually ended up having sex. During John's testimony, he told the court that he had sex with Stephanie to give her closure. Sure, you're such a nice guy, John. About a month after the cheating scandal happened, Stephanie decided to pay a visit to Sherri's work office. Stephanie sat down in Sherri's office and they talked for a couple minutes. After that conversation, Stephanie got up and left and Sherri followed her out. She was visibly shaking. Her assistant actually asked her what had happened. Sherri told her assistant that Stephanie said if she can't have John, nobody can. Stephanie also told Sherri that her and John just had sex about a month ago. Sherri went home that night after her shift was over and confronted John about the whole thing. John confessed to the whole thing, saying that yes, they did have sex. He apologized and basically said to Sherri, don't let this ruin what we have. Sherri ended up forgiving John for everything that he did, but it basically came with a caveat that John was no longer able to talk to Stephanie. Rightfully so. I mean, she's already a lunatic. During this time, Sherri also called her parents and basically told them everything that had happened and that she was very upset about the whole situation, but she was going to try to work it out with John so that they could save their engagement. It was at this time that Sherri's parents basically started to hate John. They didn't think that he was the right person for Sherri, but they wanted to support their daughter, so they didn't say anything to her. Around October of 1985, Stephanie actually stopped over at John and Sherri's apartment to drop off some skis. This visit was totally unannounced. They actually haven't really been speaking to her for a month or two, and Stephanie decided that now was the time to pay John a visit and try to rekindle that relationship. So she actually dropped off some skis and asked John if he could wax them for her. Sherri was obviously pissed that Stephanie was there. However, John agreed to wax Stephanie's skis for her against Sherri's wishes. Basically, this made Sherri and John fight. Sherri kept questioning John about their relationship, and John kept saying that there was nothing between them and they were just friends. However, if someone is threatening your soon-to-be wife, don't you think you would not want to speak to them anymore? This just doesn't make sense. John's being a complete D-bag right now. Anyway, Sherri continued to talk to her parents about all the issues that her and John were having and talk to them about Stephanie showing up. So this actually continued to drag John's name through the mud as well as Stephanie's name through the mud, rightfully so. A few days later, John was at work and Stephanie decided to stop by the apartment again to collect her skis. Sherri was actually at home at the time and felt very uncomfortable that she was there alone with Stephanie. The other reason she felt uncomfortable was Stephanie came over dressed in her full LAPD uniform. Sherri also didn't know how Stephanie kept getting into their apartment because she basically would just show up and be in their apartment. This apartment was in a gated community where you needed a key card to get in, so she was not sure how Stephanie kept getting into this complex, let alone their apartment building. Despite John cheating on Sherri and still talking to Stephanie, they got married in 1985. Despite everything that has happened in this relationship where Stephanie kept coming around and trying to put a wrench in their whole marriage, John was too much of a coward to stick up for Sherri and tell Stephanie to go away, so there was one last incident that actually happened. Sometime in January of 1986, John was actually starting a new job, so he was at work. Stephanie decided that she didn't want to go into work right away that day. She was going to go in a little later, so she was at home getting ready when Stephanie just randomly appeared in their apartment. Sherri was upstairs getting ready in their bathroom, and when she came back down, Stephanie was just standing in their living room. Again, Stephanie was dressed in her full LAPD uniform and was just standing there. Sherri had no clue how she got in again, but it was starting to freak her out. Sherri confronted Stephanie and said, "What the hell are you doing in my apartment?" Stephanie then just said, "I just need to talk to John." Obviously, John wasn't home, so Sherri got her to leave and was completely completely freaked out at this. That night, Sherri called her dad and told him everything that happened again. This was basically the last straw for Sherri. She told John that he had to tell Stephanie to leave them alone or she was gonna pack up and leave. Sherri also ended up not reporting this incident to the police. It was a bit of a messy situation because Stephanie was a police officer, so having an allegation against a police officer just breaking into their house, you definitely need some strong evidence to make that work because all the police officers are going to back their own. On February 24th, 1986, John left for work the same time he always did that morning, and Sherri decided that she wasn't going to go into work that day because she was actually due to give a speech that she didn't really agree with. It was like a motivational speech, and she basically found the material ineffective. To avoid having to give the speech, she actually called in to work. At 9:45 a.m., a couple of neighbors noticed that Sherri and John's garage door was open, which was very unlike them. Around 10 a.m., John made his first of several calls to Sherri that basically went straight to voicemail. At noon, two gardeners that worked in the complex actually gave one of Sherri and John's neighbors a purse. This purse was later identified as Sherri's. Around 12:30 p.m., a maid that was cleaning a different building said that she thought she heard a few people arguing and then something breaking. After work, John ran a few errands and arrived home around 6 p.m. That's when he noticed that there was broken glass in the driveway and the BMW was missing. As he walked into the apartment, he found Sherri's dead body. At that point, Sherri had been dead for quite some time. She was stiff and cold to the touch. The investigators were called to the scene and the investigation started. Looking around the apartment, there were electronics scattered around as if someone broke in and was trying to burglarize the place. However, none of the electronics were actually gone, and the only thing that was missing from the apartment was Sherri's car, along with the marriage license of Sherri and John. John is quickly interviewed and basically tells investigators everything that he did that day. He also told investigators about Stephanie Lazarus and everything that had happened with her. However, that's the only time that Stephanie's name is brought up until later. The first terrible investigator was the lead investigator, Lyle Mayer. Lyle basically didn't even write Stephanie's name down. Lyle brushed Stephanie's name off because he actually knew her and made the determination himself that she wouldn't do that. Lyle literally laughed off the accusation. Also, John didn't tell Sherri's parents, Nels and Loretta, that their daughter had been killed until the next day. This just goes to John's character as being a scumbag. Nels and Loretta were obviously mortified that something like this could happen to their daughter. Nels and Loretta also told lead investigator Lyles Mayer about Stephanie Lazarus. This is now the second time that Stephanie's name has come up, and she should definitely be considered a suspect at this point. But Lyles again laughs off the accusation that it would ever be Stephanie Lazarus because he knew her. Lyle ruled Stephanie out as a suspect immediately, and they came to the conclusion that this was a burglary gone wrong because of all of the electronics that were scattered about the apartment. The one thing that didn't make sense about the burglary was nothing was missing. The only thing that was missing was the vehicle and then a marriage license. To make the investigation even more biased towards the burglary accusation, there was a burglary that happened not long after this one where there was a supposed handgun that was used, and the handgun was believed to be a .38 caliber handgun. This was the same caliber handgun that killed Sherri. What investigators did find a bit odd was the bite mark on Sherri's arm. They basically said that women are typically the ones that bite. However, this had to be a guy, and the burglary suspects just committed another burglary, so we're just going to say that it's a weird coincidence that there was a bite mark. After several months of investigations and no other leads that were developed, this case went cold. Nels and Loretta were super frustrated with the investigators on this case. They would call them constantly and ask for updates, and the investigators would actually hang up on them or just never return their phone calls. Nels and Loretta were fairly well off. They were both dentists, so they went as far as to put up a reward for any information that would lead to the arrest of their daughter's murderer. murderer. In 1989, John and Stephanie actually started seeing each other again in a brief stint. They took a trip to Hawaii together with a few friends. John did say during his testimony that he actually called investigators to verify that Stephanie didn't have anything to do with the murder before he started seeing her again. This is basically him trying to get validation for his actions, which are horrible. It was also noted that John didn't push detectives to keep investigating Sherri's case like Sherri's parents did. After learning all of this information, I think it's pretty safe to say that deep down, John really knows that Stephanie had something to do with it. At the very least, John knows what Stephanie did when Sherri was alive, and he should know that she's a crazy person and steer clear of her. However, he doesn't, and they actually continue to be friends with benefits. The horrible detective Mayer finally retires, and new investigators are brought on to the case. These new investigators started in 1993 and are also terrible. Once they started digging into this case, they found out that there were 3 months of investigative logs that were missing. These logs basically outlined everything that the investigators did. This is very suspicious because Stephanie Lazarus was actually moving up in the ranks. She was now a detective that was investigating high-end art thefts. It is believed now that Stephanie Lazarus would actually periodically check in on the investigation, and she potentially could have taken some notes out of the investigation files as well as tampered with some of the evidence. Nels and Loretta, knowing that there were new investigators on the case, made it a point to meet with the investigators and try to figure out what they knew and if there were any new leads to the case. What they found out when they did meet with the investigators were these investigators were just as bad as the first one. They basically wrote this off as a burglary as well and didn't really do any more digging into it. There was new DNA technology that was just coming out, and Nels and Loretta asked the detectives if they could get that new DNA evidence submitted. The detectives basically laughed and said, no, it's too expensive. So Nels and Loretta actually said they would pay for the DNA evidence to be submitted with this new technology, and the investigators still told them no. In the years that followed, Stephanie Lazarus continued to climb the ranks at the LAPD. She's now a teacher at the police academy, and she is very well known throughout the policing community. In 1996, she actually married a fellow LAPD officer and went on to adopt a child. John also went on to remarry and completely forget about his late wife and the glaringly obvious suspect that is sitting right in front of them. In 1990, the LAPD started a new program that would basically have them go through all of the cold cases and see if there was any DNA evidence there that would be helpful if they submitted that through with new technology. It was not until 2004 that they actually got around to Sherri Rasmussen's case. They did test the DNA taken from Sherri's bite mark on her arm, and that DNA came back as a female's DNA. They ran this through their system and it didn't have any matches. So they were basically at a dead end again. A criminalist named Jennifer Francis that actually helped with processing this DNA, she basically took a look at the case files and said, hey, you guys have been chasing the wrong people this whole time. This DNA came back as female. Jennifer combed through all of the notes in the case and noticed that there was one woman's name, and it came back to a female nurse that actually worked with Sherri. Jennifer actually called the detectives on the case and asked them about this mysterious woman, and the detectives thought that she was actually talking about Stephanie Lazarus, and they laughed and said, no, we investigated Stephanie Lazarus and she has nothing to do with this. The worst part about this is even with the new DNA evidence that was pulled and it came back as female, the detectives on the case still didn't take a look at Stephanie Lazarus as being a suspect. They're literally the worst investigators in the world. Finally, in 2009, two detectives that actually knew what they were doing took a look at Sherri's case. Detectives Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba were the new investigators on this case. They combed through all of the evidence and realized that the DNA that came back as female ruled out the whole burglary theory. They actually looked at this case as a murder suspect that staged a burglary. Thank God for these detectives. and this new refreshing start in this case because all the other detectives were super frustrating and completely blind to the fact that there could be a female suspect. Jim and Pete speculated that it was very improbable that this was a burglary because Sherri's jewelry box, which should be a huge target to any burglar, was basically just sitting there. It wasn't taken. Nothing else in the house was taken outside of the marriage license and the BMW. They basically looked at the apartment itself as well. It was a gated community, which is not usually a target of a burglary. Also, the alarm system wasn't going off, so that means someone got in there without even setting off the alarm. At the top of the steps, there was some stereo equipment, and on top of that was a VCR. If, as the evidence suggested, that this fight actually began upstairs, that VCR and stereo equipment would most likely be knocked around and be scattered across the floor. It actually makes more sense to assume that it was stacked after the murder took place. Forensic evidence actually reinforced this theory as well. There was a record player on top of a bunch of other equipment. On top of that record player was a bloodstained thumb shape. This thumb shape didn't actually have a print, which led investigators to believe that this person was wearing gloves. However, the blood on there was actually Sherri Rasmussen's. This basically suggested to them that the equipment was stacked up after Sherri had been killed. After all of this digging, investigators basically concluded that all of this equipment was left behind to stage a burglary after the murder happened. The detectives combed through all of the notes and came up with a list of 5 suspects. Stephanie Lazarus was actually on that list. It took some time, but they slowly eliminated 4 of the suspects. The last suspect that they had was Stephanie Lazarus. They knew she was still on the police force and was a very prominent figure in the police world, so they had to tread very carefully around this. They actually didn't tell anyone about the investigation and who the prime suspect was. They kept her name under wraps because they didn't want her to be tipped off about being the suspect and potentially either flee or try to interfere in the investigation. Detectives actually started looking at other aspects of Stephanie's life in the mid to late 80s. They recalled that around that time, most police officers actually preferred a .38 caliber gun as their primary backup weapon. In fact, they were actually required to carry weapons that were compatible with the federal plus P ammunition. This was the same type of ammunition that was used in the murder. Records show that Stephanie Lazarus did actually own a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber handgun. Records also show that she reported that same handgun stolen 13 days after the murder. The weird part about it is she actually reported it stolen to the Santa Monica police versus the LAPD. This was most likely to keep her out of trouble with her own police station. She actually had reported it stolen near a popular pier in Santa Monica, so the investigators now think that she most likely threw that gun over the pier and into the ocean. Without a weapon, DNA is now the only way that they're going to be able to tie Stephanie Lazarus to this murder. Detectives also looked at Stephanie's timesheet and realized that she had off the day that Sherri was murdered. They also knew that Stephanie would know to stage this as a burglary because they were actually working several burglary cases in that area at the same time. All of this information was everything the detectives needed to hear to basically say, we're going to go collect her DNA evidence. However, with her being such a prominent figure, they knew they had to be careful doing this. So they actually tailed her for a while until they found her drinking a cup of coffee. She threw that cup of coffee away, and the detectives actually went and collected that. That's how they gained their DNA evidence. Once they submitted that evidence, it came back as a positive match to the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm. With the positive DNA match, finally they had enough evidence to go arrest Stephanie Lazarus for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. However, they knew she carries a gun, she was a police officer, she could potentially turn dangerous if she decided she didn't want to go down without a fight. They actually called her to the department's headquarters. At this headquarters, it's required for all police officers to actually lock their gun up in a safe before entering. So that's why they decided they wanted to do it there. They called her in, she locked up her gun, walked into the department, and they basically told her to have a seat in an office. That's when investigators told her that they wanted to tie up some loose ends with the Sherri Rasmussen murder case because they saw her name come up in it and they just wanted to verify a few things. They talked to her for a couple hours, really kind of tiptoeing around, letting her know that they had her DNA evidence because they wanted all of the information they could get from her. They also got in her good graces right away because they basically told her they were going to bring her into this office and talk to her about it because they know there was some sensitive information about her and John in the investigation, and they knew that she was married now to another LAPD officer, so they didn't want to cause any chaos between them. And that's what they told her, to basically get her to calm down and start talking about the whole thing. During the interrogation, Stephanie did give up that she saw Sherri a few times, but she wouldn't elaborate any further on it.
I mean, what's this all about? I mean,
well, let me ask you, what ended the relationship between you and John?
It was kind of a weird relationship. I mean, we dated. I can't say that he was my boyfriend. I don't know that he would consider me his girlfriend. We dated. We did things. I played sports in college. He played basketball. His brother played basketball. It just didn't work out.
And you were saying that
it's 2009 now.
Had you ever met his wife?
I may have.
Do you remember her name or anything, or? Or what she did for a living, or where she worked, or anything about her?
Well, I think I'm going to say I think she was a nurse.
And you're saying when you went to see her, would you remember if it was at her house or at the place she worked at?
No, I'm thinking that it was probably, for some reason I want to say that the hospital seemed that, if you say he got married in 85 or something, I'm thinking that, maybe the hospital was on my way to work in Hollywood. I mean, that's kind of sounding familiar.
Would you have gone on duty?
Oh, no, I'm sure I wouldn't have. I'm pretty good about not doing stuff. I'm not saying that, you haven't done stuff on duty, but I would have been working with somebody,
Okay.
So I wouldn't think. I try to avoid doing stuff on duty.
Like I said, as we were looking at the case, and, we had read the notes as far as from Sherri's friend saying you guys had problems or words, and they got heated. And the reason we're asking you is they had mentioned that an incident at her work had occurred, and they've also told us that an incident at her house occurred.
You know what?
And this is at her house during the period of time that they're married.
That's just not sounding familiar at all. That's just not sounding. Again, if someone says that I was at her house and I had an incident with her, that just doesn't sound. Was John there? Did John say this happened? And other people were there. I don't recall. It just doesn't sound, familiar.
And this is an incident where you showed up. You weren't supposed to show up, and things got heated.
At his house? That just doesn't sound familiar. No. It's not sounding familiar.
So
not at all.
Now you're saying not familiar because it's just
Well,
you remember, or it's just.
You know what? I'd have to say I don't remember, because I don't remember. That doesn't sound familiar.
Would you remember something like that in your life?
Well, I would think, but
sort of drama involving, the other woman type of thing.
Sure. Did you ever fight with her?
You mean like we fought?
Yeah. Did you ever duke it out with her?
No, I don't think so.
You'd remember that, right? That would be pretty.
Yeah, I would think so.
Pretty specific.
Yeah, like I said,
dramatic.
Obviously, it just doesn't sound familiar. What are they saying? So I fought with her. So now I getting the jump, the leap. Excuse me, I haven't eaten. they're saying, okay, I fought with her, so I must have killed her. I mean, come on. I mean, that's, you know, I don't even know who these people are. I can't even say I met any of these people. I mean, it's insane. If it happened, I honestly don't remember.
Investigators told Stephanie that they actually had some DNA from the crime scene and asked her if she would submit to a DNA sample. She laughed and basically walked out of the room. Investigators arrested her when she walked out of the interrogation room and charged her with first-degree murder. During her trial, the judge actually set her bail at $10 million, which was actually above what the prosecution recommended. It eventually came out in the trial that Stephanie learned how to pick locks, and that is how she kept getting into their apartment all the time. This then builds the whole picture of what happened that day. Sherri was at home upstairs getting ready when Stephanie picked the lock and came in unbeknownst to her. Stephanie then snuck upstairs and shot Sherri. That bullet actually went out a window, and the glass from that window is what was seen in the driveway when John came home from work that night. A struggle then begins. Sherri, now with a gunshot wound, starts to fight Stephanie to try to get away. They don't know exactly what happened, but the house was in shambles. Stephanie then regained control of the gun and shot Sherri 2 more times in the stomach. The bite mark on Sherri's arm was actually determined to be made after Sherri was dead. I think this was a way for Stephanie to basically reclaim John. Stephanie was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life. Records also showed that in 1992, shortly after Nels and Loretta offered to pay for DNA evidence, all of the samples from the case were actually taken out of evidence outside of the bite mark sample. This DNA evidence was basically lost. No one knows what happened to it, but it was gone. Thank God they were able to save the bite mark evidence, otherwise this would still be a cold case. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen actually filed a lawsuit against the LAPD. This lawsuit was basically thrown out of court for time barred issues. If you read into it, it looks like the court system screwed them over multiple times and kind of swept this whole deal under the rug. Nothing ever came of the multiple lawsuits that they filed against the LAPD. Jennifer Francis, the criminologist that actually found the female DNA in the bite swab, also filed a lawsuit against the LAPD saying that she felt like she was being silenced. The lawsuit was actually thrown out, shut down, and she was actually forced to go to counseling. She was then taken off cases that she had been working on, and she continued to receive scrutiny regarding the lawsuit. That is my story of Sherri Rasmussen, the 26-year-old cold case that was finally solved. I hope you all enjoyed it. Until next time, thank you, and bye everyone.